Welcome back to the SampanViking on China channel. Today I'm going to talk to you on the subject of have Russia and China adopted each other's red lines? And this is based really on a distillation of the kind of news beat, the drum beat of war, really, that we're getting on a regular basis on the news these days, mixed with, interestingly enough, listening to the Duran program on YouTube discussing the very same thing, albeit not in very much detail. They were discussing other things, but touching on the same topic. And I think it's something that I'd like to talk about because it is something that is a clear indication of how the Sino-Russian Alliance actually is set up and intended to work. Now, to start with, it is, I think, a given that neither side is going to give each other a blank check. Other people have said this, I'll reiterate it, which means that if one side decides to launch a major war of aggression in its sphere of influence, it cannot guarantee or is unlikely to receive uncritical or unconditional or indeed any support from the other party. The whole idea of the alliance is to be a coordinated and carefully crafted arrangement in which there are no surprises and nothing which is just off the wall or out, or wild bull like, bull in a china shop like, and generally out of control. So whilst it is down to respecting each other's red lines and understanding the significance of those red lines and acting accordingly. But I think this goes way beyond simply providing economic and political support for the other side in the event of their red line being crossed and forcing a military confrontation. It is more of an active participation, because if they only do this, it offsets the most important part of the alliance that we have seen, which is the ability to split massively the response of the West by having simultaneous conflicts to deal with both in Europe and the Asia Pacific. So clearly it is not enough for the parties simply to give diplomatic, political, and financial support to the injured part of the alliance, because it simply gives the West the ability to dictate how these systems work, how these fights are maintained, how the conduct of the conflict is carried out, and that doesn't really achieve very much for the alliance. It is far more important because you can't guarantee that both red lines would be crossed simultaneously, therefore enabling both parties to react in their own sphere at that time. So what we need instead is a joint approach, in the same way that NATO has the attack on one is an attack on all. And this is more specifically that the crossing of the red line of one is the crossing of the red line of both, and will elicit a military response against the target, the object of that red line, as if it had been attacked. And this is pretty straightforward to understand. If, for instance, Taiwan were to declare independence, China would recover the island. If the United States and allies started to gather massive forces around Taiwan and land combat formations, combat brigades onto the island, that would trigger an immediate military response. Likewise for the Russians, if there was an attack by the Ukrainian forces against the separate Donbass republics, and or the deployment of combat battalions of NATO into Ukrainian territory, that would be a red line. Those would be the red lines, and Russia would launch an immediate offensive against the Ukraine. And again, this only really makes sense if the two things happen in consort, because this is how the response of the West is very heavily split and cannot therefore concentrate to meet head on even one of the threats, both of which are very substantial in their own right. And that is the underpinning really of détente in this kind of situation. That is the deterrence. to make sure it doesn't happen. Well, in a rational world, that would work. But again, as others have mentioned, maybe the world is a bit more unstable and dangerous at the moment for that to be a given. We do have a situation where the leader of the so-called free world in the United States is incredibly unstable. We have this figurehead president in the shape of Joe Biden, who is clearly not capable of undertaking the job. He and he is backed up by a vice president who is probably the most hated politician in all American history. In other words, if Biden were to go, no one would accept Kamala Harris as being the new president, which means that if that was to become shaky, that would be virtually, essentially a coup d'etat in the United States, because you would end up with a president and a vice president being removed and a new presidential team put in that nobody had actually elected in any form whatsoever. And I have some people have been touting that some members of the Democratic Party have been sort of promoted as being to try to create some familiarity with the US public, but that still doesn't replace the fact that the Democratic mandate would be very, very severely missing in these circumstances. So that is not a happy situation, and it is the kind of unhappy situation where domestically that might require a relative, well, considered a reckless or but considered simple military diversion, distraction from such things. Unfortunately, I think most of us understand that any such attempt of a distraction that would involve Russia and China would not be minor, it would not be controllable, and that once that tap is turned on for conflict, all attempt to control it, all attempts to direct it, and any attempts to turn it back off again will be non-starters, because once let out, these tigers have a life and a mind very much of their own. And this does need to be borne in mind by those that make policy decisions. So I think that is pretty much the main part of the topic that I was going to talk about today. There have been other areas of great interest, mainly to do with the building attack, as all part of the war drums building up on China. The fact in the British press, I don't know about internationally, in the British press, the fact that Bermuda, soon to be followed by Jamaica, are giving up the Queen as head of state, the connection between that and the sort of large Chinese investments that are being put in, as indeed the large Chinese investments that have gone in throughout the Commonwealth over recent years, are being touted as, again, sinister in some way, that they an attempt to undermine the Commonwealth, undermine the British position, and to trap all these poor countries into debt slavery to the Chinese Communist Party machine. Well, you can understand why they would do that, but the fact remains is that the Chinese are not the only potential lenders in town, and if all these developing countries found that the Chinese offer far more palatable, then the West really only has itself to blame. And in terms of loans that come with conditions, the West is in no position to lecture anyone. And the International Monetary Fund, development grants, overseas aid, all come with massive strings and ideological attachments. And so really, the attempt to sort of point the finger at China on this is frankly absurd and ridiculous. As indeed, as I'll just do a quick roundup, was the item in the BBC Today, which also talked about, which was a special called Safeguard Defenders, I think, which is clearly a pro-Taiwanese independence attack body masquerading as a Human Rights Watch type body, and which is effectively accusing China of hunting Taiwanese worldwide. Their complaint is that when Taiwanese criminals are caught abroad, they are invariably returned to mainland China instead of being returned to Taiwan. Well, why should they be returned to Taiwan? These are Chinese citizens. Let us just remind ourselves of the basic facts. There is one China. It is based in, the government of that one China is based in Beijing, and it is sovereign over all Chinese territories, including those of the Republic of China, based on the island of Taiwan. There is no country called Taiwan. It is not recognized in international law and only recognized by a small number of very small countries worldwide. So most countries would be committing an offence against international law if they returned Chinese fugitives, normally resident in Taiwan, to any part out of China other than the Chinese mainland, because that is where the sovereign government and the sovereign judicial power is based. Right, well, that is just a quick roundup of things that have been happening over the last few days. I will be looking at some of these items again, maybe in a bit more detail. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please like. If you are not a subscriber to the channel, please do subscribe. It's free and it helps the channel to grow. If you would like others to hear what I have to say, please share. And if you would like to leave an opinion or ask any kind of question, or even simply voice your support for the channel, please leave a comment and I will look to respond when I can as appropriate. Thank you very much. I look forward to you joining me on the next video.